The briefing room fell silent as Commander Jake Morrison scanned the faces of his elite Navy SEAL team. 24 hours earlier, they had received orders for what seemed impossible. A covert rescue mission deep in enemy territory where a downed aircraft held critical intelligence that could change the course of the war. The problem was getting there undetected, and Morrison knew they needed someone with very specific skills. Sarah Chen sat quietly in the back corner of the room, her small frame almost invisible among the muscular Special Forces operators. She had been assigned to their unit 3 weeks ago as a communications specialist, and most of the team still saw her as just another support staff member. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore no special insignia that would hint at her extraordinary background. Morrison cleared his throat and looked directly at his assembled team. The mission parameters were brutal. They needed to infiltrate a heavily guarded compound, extract a pilot who had sensitive information, and escape through hostile airspace. Traditional helicopter insertion was out of the question due to sophisticated enemy radar systems. The intelligence reports showed surface-to-air missiles positioned at every possible landing zone within 50 miles of the target. "Listen up, people," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of command. "This mission requires capabilities we don't typically have in our toolkit. We need someone who can think like a pilot, someone who understands aerial tactics and can navigate through enemy air defenses." He paused, studying each face in the room. "Any fighter pilots here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Most of the SEALs exchanged glances, knowing their expertise lay in ground operations, underwater missions, and close-quarters combat. They were the best at what they did, but flying high-performance military aircraft was not in their skill set. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Morrison waited for a response. That's when Sarah Chen quietly pushed back her chair and stood up. The scraping sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. Every head turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of their surprised stares. She had been listening to the briefing with growing recognition that this mission aligned perfectly with skills she had spent years developing, but rarely discussed. "I am," she said simply, her voice steady and clear despite the sudden attention focused on her. The room erupted in a mixture of surprised murmurs and skeptical looks. Sarah Chen, the quiet communications specialist who barely spoke during team meetings, was claiming to be a fighter pilot. Some of the SEALs couldn't hide their disbelief. They had worked with her for weeks, and she had never mentioned any flight experience, let alone fighter pilot training. Morrison's eyebrows raised as he studied her carefully. He had reviewed her personnel file when she joined the team, but it contained only her communications and technical qualifications. There had been no mention of flight training or pilot certification. "Explain," he said, his tone neither dismissive nor accepting, simply waiting for more information. Sarah walked to the front of the room with confident steps that seemed to transform her entire presence. The woman who had appeared small and unremarkable moments before now carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions under extreme pressure. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen, callsign Phoenix," she announced. 2 tours flying F-18 Super Hornets, decorated for valor during Operation Desert Storm, and currently rated for multiple aircraft types including the new stealth fighters. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. Morrison felt his assessment of his team member completely shift. This wasn't just a communications specialist with some flight experience. This was a combat-tested fighter pilot with exactly the expertise their desperate mission required. The irony wasn't lost on him, that the solution to their problem had been sitting quietly in the back of the room all along. The atmosphere in the briefing room transformed as Sarah approached the tactical display screen. Her teammates watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she began, examining the mission parameters with the practiced eye of someone who had spent countless hours analyzing aerial threats and planning complex flight operations. "The insertion point is here," Morrison said, pointing to a map coordinate approximately 60 miles from the target compound. "Intelligence suggests it's the furthest point we can approach without triggering their radar network." Sarah studied the topographical data and shook her head. "That won't work for this type of mission. These radar installations are positioned to create overlapping coverage zones. A traditional helicopter approach from this vector will be detected at least 40 miles out, giving them plenty of time to scramble interceptors or activate surface-to-air systems." Her analysis was delivered with quiet confidence, and several team members found themselves leaning forward to hear her assessment. The woman they had dismissed as just another support specialist was demonstrating tactical knowledge that none of them possessed. She traced flight paths on the digital map with her finger, identifying weak points in the enemy's defensive coverage that weren't immediately obvious to ground-based special forces operators. Morrison crossed his arms and studied her carefully. "What do you recommend?" Sarah's eyes lit up as she began explaining an alternative approach that utilized principles of aerial warfare most of the SEALs had never considered. "We use the mountain ranges to mask our approach signature. There's a narrow corridor between these two peaks where terrain will block radar detection until we're within 15 miles of the target. But it requires precision flying through a canyon system that most helicopter pilots wouldn't attempt, especially at night." The more she spoke, the more it became clear that Sarah's expertise extended far beyond basic flight training. She understood radar systems, electronic warfare, and the complex interplay between aircraft capabilities and enemy defenses. Her recommendations weren't just theoretically sound. They demonstrated the kind of practical knowledge that only came from real combat experience. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's demolitions expert, had been watching Sarah with growing amazement. 3 weeks ago, when she first joined their unit, he had barely paid attention to the quiet woman who seemed to blend into the background. Now she was dissecting enemy air defenses with the confidence of someone who had faced them in actual combat. "Phoenix," Rodriguez said, using her call sign for the first time. "You really flew missions over hostile territory?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. 47 combat sorties, including deep penetration strikes behind enemy lines. "I've dealt with these exact radar systems before, and I know their limitations." She turned back to the map, highlighting specific approach routes. "The key is understanding how terrain masking works with different radar frequencies and using that knowledge to stay invisible until it's too late for them to respond effectively." Morrison felt the mission dynamic shifting as he realized they had stumbled upon exactly the expertise they needed. Sarah's presence changed everything about their tactical options. Instead of relying on brute force and hoping to overwhelm enemy defenses, they could now approach the mission with the precision and stealth that only aerial expertise could provide. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength as she fully embraced her role as the team's flight specialist. "The pilot we're extracting is Lieutenant Colonel James Walker, call sign Hawk. I flew with him during my second tour. If he's still alive and conscious, he'll be expecting a specific extraction protocol that only military pilots would know. Using the wrong approach could compromise the entire operation." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Not only did Sarah possess the technical skills they needed, but she also had personal knowledge of their rescue target. What had seemed like an impossible mission was beginning to look achievable, but only because they had discovered that their unassuming communications specialist was actually a decorated combat pilot, with exactly the right experience. Morrison made his decision with the decisive speed that had earned him command of an elite SEAL team. "Chen, you've got the stick, but I want verification of your credentials and a detailed mission plan within 2 hours." He turned to address the rest of the team. "We're adapting our entire approach based on aerial tactics. Everyone needs to understand how this changes our operational parameters." Sarah felt a surge of energy as she realized Morrison was trusting her professional judgment. For 3 weeks, she had been content to work quietly in the background, handling communications and technical support without revealing her combat pilot background. The transition back to her primary role felt like putting on a familiar uniform after wearing civilian clothes for too long. "I'll need access to aircraft specifications, current weather patterns, and real-time intelligence on enemy patrol schedules," Sarah said, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to mission planning under pressure. "Also, the team needs to understand that aerial insertion changes everything about how we approach the ground phase of the operation." The next hour transformed the briefing room into an intense planning session unlike anything the SEALs had experienced before. Sarah pulled up satellite imagery, weather data, and aircraft performance charts, creating a comprehensive flight plan that accounted for dozens of variables the team had never previously considered. Traditional helicopter operations focus on getting from point A to point B safely, Sarah explained as she outlined her approach. Fighter pilot mentality is different. We think in terms of penetrating defended airspace, avoiding detection, and accomplishing the mission despite active enemy resistance. The psychological difference is crucial. She demonstrated her point by showing 2 different flight paths to the target area. The conventional approach followed established helicopter routes that prioritized safety and fuel efficiency. Her alternative route was shorter, more direct, but required flying through terrain that most pilots would consider dangerous even during daylight hours. We'll be flying at extremely low altitude, following valley floors and using ridge lines to mask our radar signature, Sarah continued. The aircraft will be operating at the edge of its performance envelope, and there's no margin for error. If we encounter unexpected wind conditions or mechanical problems, we won't have altitude or distance to recover. Rodriguez whistled softly as he studied the flight path. That's either brilliant or completely insane. Both, Sarah admitted with a slight smile. But it's also our best chance of reaching Walker before enemy forces can execute him or move him to a more secure location. Intelligence reports suggest we have a narrow window before the compound receives reinforcements. Morrison had been quietly reviewing Sarah's personnel file, which had arrived by secure communication during the planning session. Her claimed credentials were not only accurate but understated. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been one of the Navy's top fighter pilots before requesting transfer to Special Operations Support. Her combat record included decorations for extraordinary heroism under fire and successful completion of missions that other pilots had deemed impossible. Phoenix, Morrison said, using her call sign with new respect. Your file shows you requested transfer out of fighter aviation. Why did you leave combat flying? Sarah's expression grew serious as she considered how much to reveal about her personal motivations. After my second combat tour, I realized that the skills I had developed could be more valuable in support of special operations. Fighter pilots usually work alone or in small formations. Special ops allows me to use my aerial expertise to help ground teams accomplish missions that would otherwise be impossible. The answer revealed something important about Sarah's character that impressed Morrison. She had voluntarily given up the prestige and excitement of fighter pilot status to work in a supporting role that would allow her to contribute more effectively to critical missions. That kind of selfless professionalism was exactly what he valued in his team members. Park, who had been studying the proposed flight route, raised a practical concern. What happens if we take enemy fire during the approach? Fighter jets can outrun or outmaneuver threats, but a loaded helicopter isn't exactly built for aerial combat. Sarah nodded, acknowledging the legitimate worry. That's where understanding enemy tactics becomes crucial. Surface-to-air missiles are most effective against aircraft that follow predictable flight paths. By using terrain masking and unpredictable routing, we stay invisible until we're close enough that their reaction time is insufficient for effective engagement. She traced the final approach on the tactical display, showing how they would emerge from the canyon system at high speed, execute the extraction, and escape before enemy forces could coordinate an effective response. The plan was audacious, requiring split-second timing and perfect execution, but it offered their best chance of mission success. The questions came fast and pointed as Morrison tested Sarah's claimed expertise. The SEAL commander had learned through hard experience that successful special operations depended on accurate assessment of team capabilities, and he needed to verify that Sarah could deliver on her bold promises before committing lives to her recommended approach. Walk me through the defensive systems we'll face, Morrison commanded, his tone professional but demanding. Sarah moved to the intelligence display and began identifying specific threats with the precision of someone who had studied enemy capabilities extensively. SA-15 surface-to-air missile systems positioned here, here, and here, she said, marking locations on the tactical map. Effective range of 25 miles, radar-guided with backup infrared tracking. They're positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that make traditional helicopter approaches suicidal. Her analysis continued as she identified radar installations, communication nodes, and likely patrol patterns for enemy aircraft. The level of detail surprised even Morrison, who had been briefed by intelligence specialists earlier that morning. Sarah wasn't just reciting textbook knowledge, she was providing insights that could only come from someone who had faced these systems in actual combat. The canyon approach I suggested exploits a known weakness in the SA-15 targeting system, Sarah explained. When radar signals bounce off steep terrain at certain angles, they create false returns that confuse the tracking computers. I've used this technique before to penetrate defended airspace without detection. Petty Officer First Class Tommy Park, the team's sniper, raised his hand skeptically. You're talking about flying a helicopter through mountain canyons at night without being detected. That sounds like something from a movie, not a real military operation. Sarah met his challenge directly. 3 years ago, I led a strike mission against a heavily defended communications facility using exactly this approach. We flew 2 F-18s through a canyon system in Afghanistan, stayed below radar coverage until we were within striking distance, and destroyed the target before enemy defenses could respond. The technique works, but it requires precise navigation and complete understanding of how radar systems interact with terrain. The confidence in her voice was unmistakable, and Morrison found himself believing that this quiet woman might actually be capable of pulling off what seemed impossible. But he needed more than just tactical knowledge. He needed proof that she could handle the pressure of leading a complex aerial operation. "What aircraft are we using for insertion?" Morrison asked. Sarah smiled for the first time since the briefing began. "That depends on what assets you have available. Ideally, we want something with terrain-following radar, night vision capabilities, and enough stealth characteristics to minimize our radar signature. A modified Black Hawk with the latest electronic warfare suite would be perfect, but I can work with whatever we have." She paused, then added something that caught everyone's attention. "Actually, I'd prefer to pilot the aircraft myself. I know the route, I understand the defensive systems, and I have the most experience with this type of low-level penetration mission. Putting someone else in the pilot seat introduces unnecessary risk." The suggestion created immediate tension in the room. Morrison's team was accustomed to working with highly skilled support personnel, but they had never operated with someone who wanted to take active control of mission-critical systems. The idea of trusting their lives to someone they had barely known for 3 weeks was uncomfortable, even if she claimed extensive combat experience. Sergeant First Class Lisa Martinez, the team's medic, voiced what several others were thinking. "No offense, Chen, but we've been working together as a unit for months. Suddenly asking us to trust you with everyone's lives on what amounts to your word seems like a big leap." Sarah nodded, understanding their hesitation. "I get it. You don't know me yet, and trust has to be earned. But here's the reality. This mission requires someone who can think like a fighter pilot, react like a fighter pilot, and handle defensive systems like a fighter pilot. I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm friendly or because we're teammates. I'm asking you to trust me because I'm the only person in this room who has successfully completed this exact type of mission before." The room fell quiet as her words sank in. Morrison realized they were facing a decision that would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed before it even began. They could proceed with conventional tactics that intelligence reports suggested would likely fail, or they could trust their newly revealed fighter pilot and attempt something that seemed impossible but might actually work. The modified Black Hawk helicopter sat on the runway like a predator waiting to hunt. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone for whom aircraft systems were as familiar as breathing. Every component had been checked, double-checked, and verified against mission requirements. The helicopter had been fitted with additional electronic warfare equipment, terrain-following radar, and noise suppression systems that would help them penetrate enemy airspace undetected. Morrison's team watched with growing confidence as Sarah demonstrated her expertise with the aircraft. Her familiarity with complex avionics systems and her ability to explain how each piece of equipment would contribute to mission success convinced even the most skeptical team members that she was exactly what she claimed to. "The insertion will happen at precisely 0230 hours, Sarah explained during the final briefing. "Weather conditions show optimal cloud cover and minimal wind, which gives us the best chance of avoiding visual detection. We'll approach the target following this exact route, maintaining radio silence until extraction is complete." The team had spent hours rehearsing their modified insertion procedures. Traditional SEAL operations relied on predictable helicopter approaches that allowed team members to prepare for fast rope deployment from stable hover positions. Sarah's approach required them to adapt to a more dynamic insertion that would happen while the aircraft was still moving at significant speed. "Remember, we're not hovering over the landing zone like a normal insertion," Sarah emphasized. "I'll be maintaining forward momentum to minimize our exposure time. You'll have approximately 15 seconds to exit the aircraft before we need to move to a covered position." Martinez raised her hand. What if Walker is unconscious or injured? Our extraction timeline assumes he can move under his own power. Sarah had anticipated this concern. That's where my personal knowledge of Hawk becomes important. If he's conscious, he'll recognize my voice and the extraction protocols we use during joint operations. If he's injured, we adapt the timeline, but the basic approach remains the same. The mission launch approached with the kind of focused tension that preceded all high-risk special operations. Each team member performed final equipment checks while Sarah completed her pilot preparations. The transformation in her demeanor was remarkable. The quiet communications specialist had become a confident mission commander, whose expertise was driving their tactical approach. At 2200 hours, they lifted off into darkness that seemed absolute, despite their night vision equipment. Sarah's flying immediately demonstrated why Morrison had been right to trust her capabilities. The helicopter moved through the night sky with a precision and confidence that none of the SEALs had experienced before. Terrain-following radar is painting the route perfectly, Sarah announced through the internal communication system. We're following the planned flight path with minimal deviation. Estimated time to canyon entrance is 45 minutes. The flight toward enemy territory gave the team time to observe Sarah's piloting skills under operational conditions. Her handling of the aircraft was smooth and professional, but more importantly, her tactical awareness was exceptional. She continuously monitored radar systems, adjusted altitude to maintain terrain masking, and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that only came from extensive combat experience. Rodriguez found himself impressed, despite his initial skepticism. Phoenix, how many missions like this have you actually flown? This is my first helicopter insertion mission, Sarah admitted. But the principles are identical to fighter operations in defended airspace. The aircraft is different, but the tactics for avoiding enemy detection and penetrating hostile territory are essentially the same. The admission might have been concerning, but her confident handling of the complex flight environment convinced the team that her skills were transferable. As they approached the canyon system that would take them to the target area, Sarah's voice remained calm and professional. Beginning terrain masking approach in 5 minutes. From this point forward, we're committed to the mission profile. Radio discipline is critical, and everyone needs to be ready for immediate action when we reach the extraction point. The helicopter began its descent into the canyon system, and the team felt their mission transition from planning to execution. Through the night vision displays, they could see the narrow passages that Sarah would navigate to reach their target while avoiding enemy radar detection. The route looked impossibly dangerous, but her steady flying demonstrated that she had the skills necessary to make the impossible look routine. The canyon walls rose on either side of the helicopter like the teeth of some massive predator, so close that the rotor wash created visible dust clouds in their night vision displays. Sarah flew with the steady precision of someone threading a needle in complete darkness, using terrain-following radar and her own exceptional pilot skills to navigate through passages that seemed impossibly narrow for an aircraft of their size. 2 minutes to target, Sarah announced, her voice calm despite the extreme flying conditions. Surface-to-air radar is painting us, but the terrain masking is working perfectly. They know something is in the area, but they can't get a solid lock. The team prepared for insertion with the focused intensity that marked elite Special Forces operators. Each SEAL checked equipment one final time and reviewed their individual responsibilities for the ground phase of the mission. The modified insertion procedures Sarah had designed required split-second timing and perfect coordination between pilot and ground team. Morrison monitored radio frequencies, listening for any indication that enemy forces had detected their approach. The silence was encouraging, suggesting that Sarah's unconventional flight path was successfully avoiding detection systems that would have immediately identified a traditional helicopter. Approach. Target compound is visible on infrared, Sarah reported. I can see the building where intelligence indicates Walker is being held. Guard positions match the briefing data, and there's no indication they're aware of our presence. The helicopter emerged from the canyon system at exactly the position Sarah had predicted, approaching the compound from an angle that enemy defenses had not been designed to cover. Her understanding of military tactics and defensive positioning was proving as valuable as her flying skills. Beginning insertion approach, Sarah announced. Remember, we maintain forward momentum throughout the landing. Exit procedures exactly as rehearsed. The Blackhawk swept toward the compound at high speed, flaring only at the last moment to reduce velocity for team insertion. The maneuver required exceptional pilot skill and perfect timing, but Sarah executed it flawlessly. The aircraft touched down for exactly 12 seconds, just long enough for the SEAL team to exit and establish defensive positions. Morrison led his team toward the target building, while Sarah lifted off and moved the helicopter to a covered position where she could monitor radio communications and maintain overwatch of the extraction site. Her role transitioned from pilot to aerial coordinator, using her position to provide intelligence and support for the ground team. Phoenix to ground team, Sarah transmitted. You have clear approach to the target building. No movement from guard positions, and I'm not detecting any communications traffic that suggests alarm. The ground phase of the mission unfolded with textbook precision. Morrison's team neutralized guards silently, penetrated the building, and located Lieutenant Colonel Walker in a small detention cell exactly where intelligence had predicted. The rescued pilot was conscious but weakened by captivity, and he immediately recognized Morrison's team as friendly forces. Walker is secure and mobile, Morrison reported, requesting immediate extraction. Sarah had been monitoring enemy communications during the ground operation, and she detected the first signs that their presence might have been discovered. Ground team, I'm picking up increased radio chatter from the main compound. We may have triggered some kind of silent alarm. Recommend expedited extraction. The warning proved accurate as searchlights suddenly illuminated the area around the target building. Enemy forces had detected the intrusion and were beginning to respond, but Sarah's tactical planning had anticipated this possibility. The extraction site had been chosen specifically to allow rapid helicopter approach even under hostile conditions. Extraction bird inbound, Sarah announced as she brought the Black Hawk racing toward the pickup zone. 30 seconds to arrival. Be ready for immediate departure. The helicopter appeared with dramatic suddenness, emerging from behind terrain features that had concealed its approach. Sarah's flying during the extraction was even more impressive than her insertion skills, as she maneuvered the aircraft through defensive fire while maintaining perfect positioning for team recovery. Morrison's team reached the extraction point just as the Black Hawk touched down. Walker, despite his weakened condition, moved with the urgency of someone who understood that their lives depended on speed. The entire extraction took less than 20 seconds before Sarah was lifting off and heading for the safety of friendly territory. All personnel aboard, Morrison confirmed. Package secured and extraction complete. Enemy forces opened fire as the helicopter departed, but Sarah's escape route took them immediately behind terrain features that blocked most incoming fire. Her understanding of defensive systems and escape tactics proved as valuable during departure as it had been during the approach phase of the mission. The return flight to friendly territory showcased Sarah's complete mastery of aerial tactics under hostile conditions. Enemy forces had scrambled interceptor aircraft and activated every available surface-to-air missile system, creating a defensive network that would have been impossible for conventional helicopter operations to penetrate. But Sarah's escape route exploited the same terrain masking principles that had enabled their successful insertion. 2 enemy fighters airborne and searching, Sarah reported while maintaining the complex flight path that kept them invisible to pursuing aircraft. They're following standard search patterns, which means they don't have our exact position. We stay in the canyons for another 15 minutes, then break for friendly airspace. Lieutenant Colonel Walker, despite his ordeal, was alert enough to recognize the exceptional flying skills that had made his rescue possible. Phoenix, this is Hawk. Outstanding work on that insertion. I've never seen helicopter flying like that in a combat environment. Sarah's response revealed both her professionalism and her understanding of what had just been accomplished. Good to have you back, Hawk. The mission succeeded because we had the right team with the right skills. Everyone contributed exactly what was needed. Morrison found himself reflecting on how dramatically his assessment of Sarah had changed over the course of the mission. The quiet communications specialist who had seemed unremarkable 3 weeks ago had just demonstrated capabilities that elevated their entire team's operational potential. Her transformation from background support to mission leader had been seamless and natural. Command, this is Bravo Team, Morrison transmitted as they approached friendly airspace. Package recovered successfully. Mission complete. The celebration in the helicopter was subdued but genuine. Each team member understood that they had just completed a mission that should have been impossible. and they knew that success had depended entirely on Sarah's unique expertise. The bonds formed during high-stress operations were different from ordinary team relationships, and Sarah had earned a place of respect that went far beyond her official position. Rodriguez spoke for the entire team when he addressed Sarah directly. "Phoenix, I owe you an apology. When you stood up in that briefing room, I thought you were either crazy or lying. Now I understand that you were just exactly what we needed." Sarah's response was characteristic of her understated approach to leadership. "Every team member brings different skills to the mission. Today happened to be a situation where my background was particularly relevant. Tomorrow it might be your demolitions expertise or Martinez's medical training that makes the difference." The helicopter touched down at their base as dawn broke over the horizon. The mission had taken less than 6 hours from takeoff to landing, but it had fundamentally changed the team's understanding of their collective capabilities. They had learned that expertise sometimes came in unexpected packages, and that effective teamwork meant recognizing and utilizing each member's unique strengths. Walker was immediately taken for medical evaluation and intelligence debriefing, but not before expressing his personal gratitude to the team that had risked everything to bring him home. The information he carried proved to be as valuable as intelligence reports had suggested, justifying the extreme risks they had taken to extract him. Morrison submitted his after-action report with recommendations that Sarah be formally recognized for her contributions to mission success. Her transition from communications specialist to lead pilot had been flawless, and her tactical expertise had turned an impossible mission into a textbook example of successful special operations. 3 days later, Sarah was back in the communications center, quietly handling technical support duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But her teammates now knew the truth about their unassuming colleague. The woman who blended into the background was actually one of the most capable combat pilots in the military, someone whose skills could transform impossible missions into achievable objectives. Experience had taught everyone involved an important lesson about recognizing talent and not making assumptions based on appearances or initial impressions. Sometimes the most valuable team members were those who worked quietly in the background, waiting for the moment when their unique expertise would be exactly what the mission required. Sarah Chen, call sign Phoenix, had proven that true leadership sometimes meant knowing when to step forward and when to step back, when to reveal capabilities and when to work quietly in support of others. Her calm response to Morrison's question had revealed not just her professional qualifications, but her understanding that effective teams succeeded when every member was ready to contribute their best skills when the situation demanded it.